Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth IT at Cork Tech Talk of 2021. My name is Juliette Crowley, and I'm the COO with IT at Cork. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with IT at Cork, but for those of you who aren't, we represent nearly 200 technology companies in the southwest of Ireland. We provide access to training and upskilling, events where members can learn the latest in technology trends, as well as networking and learning and sharing opportunities. We also strive to promote our member companies and the southwest of Ireland as a location for technology companies. This morning's Tech Talk will look at open source, and our expert panelists will be discussing their thoughts and experiences on the subject. They will consider why open source is ubiquitous in the technology sector, the opportunities for enterprise to adopt open source, as well as the risks and benefits. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Tech Talk Committee for organising this event, and our panelists and MC for giving their time and expertise this morning. So our panelists include Karen Egan from VMware, Stephen Stack from EY, Joe Lennon from WorkVivo, and our MC this morning is Jerry Sweeney, who's founder and MD at CloudKicks. So I hope you all enjoyed this event, which I'm sure is going to be highly interactive. I'll now hand over to Jerry and just ask you to note that this event is being recorded and that there will be an opportunity for questions, so please feel free to post on the Q&A facility. Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Juliette. Welcome, everybody. I really welcome the opportunity to assist with the session here this morning. In my day job in CloudKicks, I talk to lots and lots of companies, and what I've noticed is a huge spread in those companies with regard to their attitude to open source. On the one hand of that spectrum, we have companies that are kind of born in the cloud, companies like Joe's company, WorkVivo, okay, who use open source extensively, who are doing software development, who realize that they, in order to get a competitive advantage, they need to be part of that community. And at the other end of that spectrum, I see companies that are risk averse, need to purchase from companies with an SLA, need to get support contracts. But in the middle, I see a spectrum. I see things that are moving towards the open source side of things. And one of the things we want to do this morning is to encourage people along that journey. There is a competitive advantage to being aware of what's going on and to benefit from that. This is just a montage of some of the companies that offer open source software that are available. In setting up this talk, when we were looking for panelists, we found it impossible to find somebody who was against open source. Okay, so there isn't going to be much of a debate in the sense of, so it's not a question of open source is bad, open source is good. It's a question of where you are along that journey. And when we were discussing this in preparation, we decided that Microsoft was a very good example. And if you look at Satya Nadella over the last couple of years since he took over at Microsoft, Microsoft have moved 1000% in the direction of open source, purchasing GitHub and making the patents for their operating system available to Linux free of charge. So I found this entry in the register, okay, from 2001, where Ballmer described Linux as a cancer, and from 2014, where Satya Nadella said Microsoft loves Linux. So I think the theme you're going to hear this morning is the world is moving. It is a spectrum. If you're on the spectrum, we want you to move forward in that direction. For many years, I ran a coder dojo in Kicks, and I suppose I stopped doing that when my kids grew beyond the age where they were interested. But I started again recently on Zoom, okay, and every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, I do an open source dojo. I spoke to Bill Lau and asked him, had he any objection to me using the word dojo in the name, and he said he would be delighted. So I'm doing it with somewhat the blessing of the Coder Dojo Foundation. You can track down the meeting ID on LinkedIn, but it's there on the screen if anybody wants to take a screenshot of it. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have three panel experts. I'm going to hand over to Karen Egan from VMware. After that, we will have Joe Stack. After that, we'll have Stephen Stack, and then we'll have Joe Lennon. So Karen, if you can take over, please, that would be fantastic.
Great, thanks so much, Jerry, and thanks for inviting me here to speak about this today. As Jerry said, in today's world, it's hard to find people who are against using open source code, but I suppose my history and background, I've been 25, almost 26 years in the software industry and worked for several multinationals where we've been delivering and supporting software for large enterprise businesses. So when I look back at that comment from Larry in 2001 and where a lot of software companies were believing that open source was like a cancer, shall we say, and to where we are now and the journey, it's not open source is the future. Open source has arrived and all companies are using it today. What I've learned along that journey is that there's always a lot of concerns about moving to open source, such as security, maintenance, bug fixing, can I run it at an enterprise level? But I think for me, when you look at what open source brings and the value it brings to a business, it far outweighs these concerns. And a lot of these concerns are myths as far as I'm concerned. So for example, the motivations and why I believe open source is a really positive journey for anyone is that when you think about open source and we talk about it being a free software, that really means for me that you're not paying for the right to use the underlying intellectual property, right? So you can go and take that intellectual property. You can focus on your own unique compelling USP in your industry by taking those libraries, building on top of them, and actually delivering. It doesn't mean that there's no cost to running open source software. When you're realistic about it, the licensing is going to be free. The implementation, you're going to have developers and operators that run and implement that environment. Maintenance, and there's several ways to think about this maintenance and support is, do you have internal developers that are going to maintain and support what you run and operate internally, as well as give back to the open source community? Are you looking to have an enterprise level open source support contract? And there's many technology companies out there today that actually deliver that level of support. Smaller forums and smaller projects may not be at that level today, but many of the large that you saw there from Jerry, large projects will have enterprise level support. And for me, with that lower cost of total ownership, it also brings a shift in what you do in your company, moving from low value work to high value work, right? Your developers are not there reinventing what's already being delivered. Take that through the open source community, and then you can focus, as I said, on the unsolved challenges that your business needs to deliver to be successful. And the third thing I think that really emphasizes the open source strategy is that when you think about it, more people means better quality, right? So in these open source communities, and they really are communities that are built on the philosophy that the community comes first and the code will always get better. And if you've got the best developers working on the code across many companies, you are going to get the best and most innovative software. And when you do hit these major bugs, the likelihood is that they're going to be fixed faster. And bugs will come in all software, whether it's proprietary or whether it's open source. So for me, that's been a journey and a shift, right? Coming from traditional enterprise proprietary software, especially when I worked in telco. And as we all know, back then, the telco stacks would have been very much delivered as totally proprietary and very hardened. Today, as you shift forward 10 to 15 years, the changes we're seeing in the industry are phenomenal. VMware as a company contributes to many open source projects, and that's not just for the good of the community. It is great to be part of those communities, but it also makes good business sense. We package and deliver open source software as part of some of our products. So as I said, we can focus on, and our developers can deliver on the unique problems we're trying to solve, while also being able to avail of that open source community and give back to the community. So as we give back, is there a concern that we're delivering away proprietary information? No. We're delivering to libraries that everybody can use, but we're also building on top of those to deliver a stronger business value for our customers and our company. So for me, it's a win-win situation. And I know that Stephen will talk about both sides of delivering into the communities, but also running the open source. But just looking at the journey companies have gone on today, for me, I honestly believe that open source is absolutely fundamental to being able to develop faster, to be agile, and to get the best and innovative software that you can run and deliver in your products. And I leave you with one last thought. I know that for years there was a lot of concern around the licensing of this software, and understanding that as communities of developers began first, a lot of the licensing was actually written by developers, and then it comes into an enterprise and it's lawyers that are looking at those licenses and the differences between both of those, right? But for me, there's I see now there's very good standards out there with those licensing and well understood. So so for you, as you're looking at it, I would say if you're not using open source today, not contributing to it, the first step is to really understand first what it can bring to your organization, set up some policies. How do you want to use it? How are you going to implement, maintain, and support that? So those are questions you need to think about and drive forward. But my feedback today is get on that journey if you're not already there. Every company I work with today, and I support all of VMware's customers worldwide, are using open source in some way, shape, or form to drive their business forward. So with that, Jerry, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fantastic, Karen. We're going to ask Stephen to speak next, and Stephen is very interesting. He'll explain this, okay, but he's got the day job, okay, where he sits on the enterprise side. But what's very interesting is he runs an open source project in his own time. So I'm really interested to hear Stephen's views. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, as you said, I have a leg in kind of multiple camps here. But look, just to say, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I'm a huge open source fan and advocate, and have been for 10 years at this point. So just a quick background on me. I'm currently a CTO in the Microsoft Services Group in EY. So when Jerry mentions Microsoft and their journey, you know, I've witnessed that firsthand over many years, and touch on that a little bit later. Very interestingly, as Jerry mentioned, I'm an open source maintainer. So I run a project called rconfig, and I'll touch on that shortly as well. And I have an extensive enterprise IT background. So some of the points that Karen was making around enterprise IT, I'm going to touch on as well. First, with open source, maybe as a foundation for innovation and personal growth for me, I started a project 10 years ago called rconfig, and I did it out of necessity and need in a role that I had at the time, where I found that commercially proprietary software just wasn't giving us what I needed to do my day job. So great impetus, great motivation to do a couple of things. One, resolve the need. Two, go on a personal kind of growth journey and give back to the community. So I built rconfig and released it in 2011. You know, it was built on a full open source stack of technologies. I was the single maintainer for many years, you know, doing the back end, the front end, the user experience, the licensing, the legalities, the, you know, jack of all trades, right? And had to learn on the job. But the feedback was tremendous. You know, this was something that was obviously desperately needed in the network engineering community. Sorry, I should have probably said what it is. rconfig is a network configuration management tool. So it allows network engineers and architects to download configurations from their network devices, back them up and run policy checks on them. It's deployed in over 20,000 companies globally at the moment, and there's still, you know, hundreds of downloads every month. It spawned into a community at one point, and then that fell off. You know, developers just went their separate ways and got interested in different things. And that's what I've noticed about open source over the years is, you know, it ramps up and then, you know, kind of tails off sometimes. And it depends on the motivation of the maintainer and different things. But I can understand, and I've had this feedback as well, about the challenges of adopting open source for businesses in respect of maybe some smaller projects or different things where maybe there's a single maintainer or not, a significant community of maintainers, or if it doesn't have commercial backing that we see some open source have today. So that's rconfig. The next point is really about with my kind of enterprise hat on, and I think about, well, open source from an enterprise perspective. And I draw the distinction in open source between enterprise open source and, I don't know, you might call it kind of native open source, or well, you say non-enterprise open source, right? And examples of enterprise open source might be like Kubernetes, in Karen's case, you know, Pivotal Cloud Foundry, where we have an open source project that is commercialized and supported, right? And to me, that's enterprise open source. Microsoft have been a huge advocate in this area, as Jerry mentioned, and Kubernetes is a perfect example. That cloud native container platform that is open source and maintained by a significantly large community, but is also backed by you know, major enterprises, you know, Google and Microsoft, and that whole cloud native computing foundation that was established to manage this ecosystem of open source software. What the commercial model, so I think about my experience where I spent the last 7 years in Dell, and we had a department for managing open source and managing risks associated with open source, and kind of realized that having a department, not for everybody. You know, Dell's a particularly big company, but there's definitely ways to manage the risks or the perceived risks around adoption of open source. And I think the first thing is establishing whether it's an enterprise, you know, commercially backed product that you're investing in, and that's a, you know, supported platform. The other one is if you're going down the, you know, I'm going to download from a GitHub repo and use it in my, you know, website or a product that maybe that I'm selling on, right? And I think that second one is where you need to manage the risks a little bit more closely. And not saying you don't need to manage any risks with the first one, but you know, for Dell, obviously managing risks with the kind of first one where you've got contractual arrangements with those vendors who resell, such as VMware, open source packages. You know, that's a business as usual, I think, if I can simplify it. We did just manage the kind of non-enterprise open source a little bit more carefully, monitor the community input, look at license, legal, security, dependency management, training, support, and skills were definitely an issue for the adoption of some open source projects. So the commercial models for enterprise open source are interesting also because they've definitely shifted in recent years. I think if I think about Red Hat, I think about them, you know, selling subscription-based access to open source, you know, so you can get your updates for your Red Hat Enterprise Linux and different things. But Kubernetes and, you know, Pivotal Cloud Foundry have definitely went down the more cloud route. And I think cloud has been a catalyst for enterprise open source because companies like Microsoft can now commercialize the software by selling cloud services and, you know, with the software layered on top, and then you get your support and your bug fixes, you know, your updates and everything kind of included in that. So that's definitely been a catalyst for enterprise open source in recent years, and it's been a really positive thing, and you know, to aid in the adoption of enterprise open source. In my current role, I guess I'm very fortunate to work across, you know, top tier national clients, you know, discussing Microsoft technologies, open source technologies. You know, I work across verticals in healthcare, government, financials, utilities, etc. So one of the specific examples just to bring up, so, you know, I talked about rconfig, I talked about enterprise open source, but the adoption of an open source platform in healthcare has been, I guess, somewhat of an eye-opener for me, right? There's a project called HL7, which aims to be, and has been for nearly 30 years, an open data standard for healthcare. And that open data standard has a specific open data set called Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, called FHIR. And that's adopted by healthcare institutions all over the world, right? And particularly as well here in Ireland, some of our top tier healthcare institutions. It's an open standard with open implementations. And I guess the reason I raised it is because, you know, healthcare is one of those industries that, you know, are, for very good reasons, risk averse, careful and slow to make decisions. You know, this affects all of our lives, right? And even the healthcare industry have looked at an open specification, adopted an open specification, implemented an open specification, and mandates the implementation of this open specification into any technologies that it consumes for information sharing purposes. Recently, Microsoft have announced Azure API for FHIR, F-H-I-R, and Azure Server for FHIR, which is open source. So what they've done is they've taken the open standard, developed and deployed an open implementation of it on GitHub, and then they've commercialized it by implementing it on Azure. So fascinating model, and really, again, just to underscore how open source is really benefiting us in our daily lives, as well as, you know, from a risk perspective in enterprises and institutions, that they adopt and consume open standards and open implementations of standards, you know, ubiquitously, I guess. So, you know, just to kind of round it out, you know, I talked about open source as a foundation for innovation and for personal growth for me. And I'm not sure I would be in my career where I am today if it wasn't for open source. So with that hat on, you know, I'm very grateful for the open source community and initiatives and different things, and my ability to kind of grow into that. Enterprise open source in respect of managing risk and the commercial models around open source make it much more consumable for businesses, large and small, I would say. And then, you know, the specific example of healthcare and some of the open standards that have been adopted there for many years, I think just really underscore the prevalence of open source across, you know, industries. So just one more thing, and I'll hand it back to Jerry. And my kind of consideration leading up to this webinar, I came across a recent Red Hat State of Enterprise Open Source report. So I'm going to post that on LinkedIn this morning. If anyone wants to connect, you should connect with me, and you'll see that report on LinkedIn later this morning. So that's me, Jerry. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Stephen, that was fantastic. And I'm going to try and tease more of your experience as a contributor in the questions afterwards. So earlier we described open source as a spectrum, that people are, it's a journey, okay, from left to right. Well, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and I'm going to describe him as being on the ultraviolet side of that spectrum, okay? So Joe, can you talk about WorkVivo and what open source means to your community, sorry, to your company, and how you're involved in the various communities? Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, so I'm delighted to be here this morning and to share my open source journey. So my name is Joe Lennon. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of WorkVivo. We're a centralized employee communication platform that enables companies to reach, connect, and engage their employees wherever they work from. We started our company here in Cork in 2017, and we have some of the world's greatest companies using our product, and we now have 55 employees spread all over the world. My own background is in software development. I started my career as a software engineer, excuse me, and I've been obsessed with technology and computers since I was a child. My youngest, or my earliest experiences with open source actually go right back to when I was 12 years old, when I ruined our family computer by trying to get it to dual boot with a Linux distribution using a CD that I got on the front of an issue of PC Plus magazine. But undeterred by this experience, I spent a lot of time in my teenage years exploring different open source operating systems, including various flavors of Linux, as well as less popular systems like OpenBSD and NetBSD. Excuse me, my voice is going. When I was in my teenage years, then I for a time ran an IRC server on a Linux box, which was subsequently shut down by my hosting provider due to some of my users thinking that it would be fun to launch regular DDoS attacks on it. And then since then, I've been involved in different ways, I suppose, in open source. I've written a couple of IT books, including one on an open source NoSQL database technology called CouchDB. And no, I can absolutely assure you that I'm not living off the royalties of that one. It was, let's just say, it didn't hit the NYT bestseller list. I've been working with open source technologies pretty much throughout my career. In my first job, most of my work was more with proprietary technologies. So Core HR, the company I worked for, they were an Oracle shop. So I spent most of my day working with PL, SQL, and various Oracle products, and wishing I was working with open source tools. And as a result, the main extent of my experience with open source around that time was on side projects where I would use things like PHP and Python and frameworks like Ruby on Rails and Django. After 7 years at Core, I joined another Cork startup called Versa as their CTO, and they were mostly a Microsoft shop running on .NET and SQL Server. And this was before Microsoft decided that open source was no longer their sworn enemy, as Jerry alluded to earlier. But when it came time to start my own companies, I finally had an opportunity to leverage the benefits of open source frameworks and tools to the fullest extent. And I suppose when you're looking at what the benefits are of open source, and I know Karen spoke about this earlier, I think it's easy to be drawn to looking purely at the cost element of it. But I think in my experience, the true benefits are really in the community, the knowledge, and the innovation that open source libraries and toolkits have to offer. In many cases, we've seen something come up that has required a major change to a library or a framework that we're using in our product. And in the proprietary world, like, you really are truly at the mercy of the vendor. You can apply pressure and do everything you want, but this change may or may not happen. And when it happens, is completely up to the vendor. Whereas in the open source community, the community usually, not always, but it usually responds much faster. We've seen this scenario occur and we've seen results in hours. And if it doesn't, you do have access to the code. So you can always just do this yourself if you have the means. And the liberty that having access to the underlying code really does provide a lot of other benefits. Sure, you can make changes to the code yourself. You can get involved in the community. You can contribute any changes that you make back upstream to the project you're using. Or if the project goes in a direction that doesn't work for you or your company, you can fork it and you can choose to take it down a different path. But for me, like, the real game changer in open source is the level of understanding that this open access to the source code provides developers with in the mechanics of the technologies and tools that they're using. You know, I routinely find myself navigating through the source code for frameworks that we use in WorkVivo, and I get a deep understanding of the internal foundation of how these things work. And this is incredibly powerful because it allows you to become knowledgeable in something without having to build it from scratch for yourself. It allows, like, it empowers you with a level of understanding that really gives you like a lot of extra confidence that no matter what happens, you always have a pathway to figuring out what's going on and to making changes that resolve any issues you might encounter. And I think, you know, with closed source and proprietary software, this is simply not an option. And I think, you know, there's also something quite special about the sense of community and collaboration that you see and you experience as part of an open source community. Now, I'd be lying if I said it was always perfect. I think I've probably seen more drama on GitHub discussions for open source projects than I have in my kids' classrooms. But, you know, seeing an open source community, a group of people who in most cases have likely never met each other, you know, in a lot of cases never even seen or even directly interacted with each other outside of these online forums. Seeing that type of collaboration at work at scale is really something like quite amazing to witness. You know, I'm not an avid contributor myself, as much as I'd like to be, but I am truly simply in awe at the capability of the people who contribute to open source projects. You know, they truly are some of the most talented people that you will ever meet, and so generous with their time. In many cases, you know, getting little thanks in return, and a lot of expectations. I think coming back to what you asked at the start, Jerry, about like open source is really an enabler. I think it's a huge enabler for companies of all sizes, but it is particularly an enabler for startups and companies like WorkVivo. You know, it essentially allows us to do things that just simply would not be possible otherwise. It enables us to compete with many companies who, in many instances, are many orders of magnitude larger than we are, with armies of developers and teams that are larger than our entire company. And it allows us to beat them. So I think on the flip side of it, you know, like one question that was raised in the QA was about the importance of due diligence on open source packages and frameworks and tools that you're using. And it's a hugely important point, and it's something that impacts companies of all sizes. So not just large enterprise companies, but also startups like us. And it's not just about the governance of the licenses that open source frameworks and toolkits that developers may be using are bound by, but actually the level of trust that you can place on the maintainers and the contributors to do the right thing with the project that they're running. And we've all seen the disaster scenarios, the node modules where a rogue developer decided to make a change, and you know, it sent ripples through the open source community as all of the packages that were dependent on that package started to experience issues as a result. And these are things that you have to be extremely careful and diligent about, not just in large companies, as I said, but also in startups like ourselves. Thankfully, there are tools out there that make it easier to manage these risks nowadays. So tools like SNCC come to mind. But of course, it's still vital for any companies using open source tools to be very aware of potential risks and to do proper due diligence on anything that they're using. So I think that pretty much sums up my journey to date, and the role open source has played in that journey. I think it's pretty safe to say that I'm a big advocate for using open source. I would definitely actively encourage companies of all shapes and sizes to embrace it. I believe that large enterprise organizations have a lot to gain from not just using open source technology, but also from getting involved and from contributing back to the community. Another question that was raised was around, you know, how large enterprises can give back and contribute back to open source communities. And I think, you know, like Karen from VMware can attest to this, that, you know, VMware are hugely involved with a lot of open source projects and communities and run many themselves. And I think, you know, these days it's becoming a lot more common to see large organizations sponsoring financially and financially supporting the work of open source maintainers and contributors, and essentially securing the future of the projects that they rely on in their companies. And this is a model that I very much support, and I think it's important for the sustainability of open source into the future. So that's it from me, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. That's fantastic. And according to the poll that we've conducted, okay, then Stephen's apartment is the nicest of all of us. Okay, so he's won by a majority there. I'm looking at the questions coming in. The thing that's interesting for me about the questions is that the majority of the questions actually relate to licensing. I think what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to pick a representative one here. So there's quite a few on licensing, and Karen has responded to some of those online, but I just want to bring them into the general debate. And I've chosen this one because it's from Donald Hunt, and I think it kind of sums up a lot of what's happening with the question. So let me read his one out, and then I want to expand it a little bit in terms of the other questions. So Donald's question is, many open source licenses require entities utilizing the software/code to credit the source, and in some cases a copy of the code, modified or not. What challenges does this bring to enterprises, and how are companies managing this? So I'm actually just going to, because I'm looking at other questions as well, I'm going to expand that a little bit. I'm going to ask the three panelists to help me out in understanding that, but I'm going to ask them to give the answer in two flavors. Donald mentions their enterprise. If you're consuming the code internally, does that remove some of the problems around licensing and proper attestation? If you're reselling, repackaging, and distributing the code, does it make it more difficult? So if I run that question maybe in the order that we did the talk, just to help people, but I think everybody's contribution is valid. Karen, do you want to help us with that? Do you want to talk to us about licensing, and licensing in the case of in-house use versus redistribution maybe?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. Definitely redistribution, and when you're packaging open source software to license and sell and maintain within your own commercial software, it's really important for you to understand the licensing of that open source software. So as Stephen talked about earlier, understanding that licensing is important, and there is different kinds. There's permissive and non-permissive, where you can change, like Apache 2.0, for example, non-permissive, where if you make changes to the open source libraries, you are going to have to give that back to the community, right? So that's the first thing to be very aware of. Now, open source, and a lot of open source comes as libraries. So even in the case of non-permissive, if you take that library and don't modify that library, but you're building functions that interact with that library, those functions can be proprietary. You don't need to open those up. It's up to you thinking about what you want to do. Is the code that you're developing proprietary that you do not want to make public for some reason? But if you fundamentally change the libraries that you're interacting with, then you do need to contribute that back. So it's understanding that, I would say, running the software internally, just running the software and operating the software, you don't need to commercially worry about that. But if you're changing the software, absolutely need to contribute back. So for me, I think the key thing for companies to understand as you look at your open source journey is how you're going to use the software, number one. Number two, why, for any reasons, you would want something to be proprietary, and number three, ensuring that you are giving back if you're commercially using the software. So I think for me, those would be three guidelines I would go by. But I'll hand over to Stephen to get his viewpoint as well.
Thanks, Karen. You know, when I saw the questions coming up, I said I'd do a quick Google, not for the answer, but just in relation to rconfig. It's been through two generations. The first one was completely native PHP, so not really a lot of libraries coming into it, supporting it. It was really built from the ground up. But those that I did use, you know, like Bootstrap and different things for the UX, you know, I had to check the licensing, right, to make sure that either I was crediting even down to icons in your UI, right? I had to check the licenses to make sure that credit was given, because I certainly didn't want any comeback on me personally. This was a free, part-time maintainer of an open source project. So I did that. And then when I went through the second generation of rconfig, I made sure everything had an MIT license. And it's not, and I'll speak about MIT in a second, it's not that I didn't want to credit the packages that I was using, the maintainers of these other these kind of upstream dependencies, but I just didn't want the project to be restricted, right? So the thing to know about MIT licensing is it's extremely permissive. It's basically, if I can simplify it way down, it's a free for all. Here's a license, have at it with the software. And I think that's good. And I also know, and what I Googled was that the amount of MIT licenses with open source projects today is by far and away number one, right? That's not to say you shouldn't check what licenses are attached to packages or software that you're downloading and intending to use. So it's the responsibility of businesses and IT and software leaders to understand the ecosystem that they're building in terms of a product or a package, and understand the upstream dependencies and where their commitments lie in respect of the licenses. And not all open source projects are MIT licensing. That needs to be accounted for, and any restrictions on that licensing, such as giving credits, such as not making changes, etc., right? That just needs to be taken into account. And if you need to pivot because of your commercial model, or however you're going to package this and distribute it onwards, assuming you're a business that sells software or has a SaaS service or something, and just do the due diligence, and if you need to run it by your legal team, run it by your legal team. These licenses are fairly standard, and they're not extensive, but you do need to know the obligations you're under. So that would be my point of view from an enterprise perspective. So Joe, passing the baton along.
Yeah, I think, look, just like jumping in from my perspective on this, I think one of the biggest challenges is that often the people who care about licensing are not the people who actually care about the libraries and frameworks that they want to use. Like, a developer is going to be looking at a library or a framework for the functionality it provides, or the effort that it saves them, or the innovation that it brings to the table, or they're the parameters that they're searching for libraries. And oftentimes it's not like you're going to a marketplace where there's an abundance of choice. Oftentimes it's a case of, I can either use this library or I can write it myself. And they're the decisions that you're facing as a developer. So licensing and open source licensing, I think what it means is that, and I think, Stephen, you made this point, and I think it's a really important one, is that it's fundamentally up to the leaders within software organizations to help to create a strong culture of awareness around open source licensing and the implications of that for the organization as a whole, but also to bring automation and tooling to the table that can help with making this easier for developers and for the organization as a whole. So I mentioned earlier a tool called SNCC, which we use in Workvivo, which not only helps with compliance on licensing and allows us to define a policy that anytime we want to bring a package into our product, is automatically scanned to see if its license is compatible with our policy. But it also helps with things like package vulnerability management and so on as well, and which is incredibly important when you consider the dependency chain. And I think that's the dependency chain is probably one of the other points that I would make. So for anybody who's not familiar with using open source libraries and frameworks within a technology, oftentimes you might be looking at bringing in a new library and using that in your product, or using that in a tool that you're building, and that might have a permissive license, and it looks like it's a-okay and you're ready to go. But so many packages, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem and with NPM and node modules, they're in often cases they could be using hundreds, whether directly or indirectly, they could be using hundreds of other dependencies. And what you're really saying is that if you've looked at their license, are you trusting that their license and all of the licenses of all of the dependencies, the entire way down the chain of their dependency chain, are all compatible with your policy? So it's absolutely vital that you're leveraging tooling. It's not something you want to be doing manually, and there's too many of them to keep track of. So you want to be using automated tooling to make your lives easier, and to not be putting the emphasis, like not to be putting the onus on the developer to like have to be too overly like not concerned, but to be putting too much thought into it, and just make it easier for them to make those decisions quickly and have that information available to hand. So one other thing, so like Jerry, you mentioned about licensing, and like I think the reason why so many questions around open source center on licensing is I think it's the area of open source that creates the most challenges and creates the most problems, right? So one thing I remember like from my core HR days, we started using a front-end framework back in I think 2008 called EXTJS or XJS, and this was a framework that at the time was delivered on this kind of dual licensing model, where you had the open source license, which was built on some version of the GPL. I can't remember which version. I always get confused between the liberal and non-liberal ones, or the permissive and non-permissive ones. But essentially, and then they had a commercial model, so you could pay, to be able to use their commercial model. And then you had a support framework and all that kind of thing around it. Very typical in open source today. But one of the things that they were concerned with as a company was that I don't think they were making as much money as they needed to, and a lot of the enterprise organizations they were working with were using the open source version, and they weren't benefiting from the commercial license. So they changed their license from one version of the GPL, and this just goes to show how complicated the whole licensing ecosystem is that they changed from one version of a specific license to another version of that specific license, which was far less permissive, and essentially meant that if you wanted to use this framework in a commercial project, you essentially had to use the commercial license. You couldn't really use the open source license unless you wanted to make all of your code public, essentially, right? So there was complete outcry, and it had a decimating effect on that project and on the open source element of that project, because it made a stark change. But it's just an example of one of the things that, when you're looking at open source projects, these are the types of things that can happen. And these are the types of things that you need to be aware of and ready for. And you just don't know when they're going to happen. So, but as I said, I'm very much a proponent for open source, but you do need to go in with your eyes open, and you do need to have a very strong level of awareness.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Joe, could you spell for us the name of that tool? It sounded like snake, but I didn't catch it properly. How do you spell it?
Yeah, it's SNYK.
SNYK. Okay, cool.
Thanks, if you search for open source compliance, it's you probably see a Google ad for it. It says so. Okay,
cool. We have about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is get a kind of a good, bad, and ugly kind of situation for open source. So what I'm expecting is that there are enterprise people attending who are kind of, should I, shouldn't I? Okay, so in order for us to end on a positive note, I'm going to do it from the negative end. So what I want to do in the next 3 minutes is just throw out there, what are the negatives with open source? So I'm going to ask people to suggest, and based on the questions coming in, some of the things, Joe, you actually mentioned as well, okay, if a library gets a bug, you mentioned something about Node, okay, then a whole lot of dependent libraries get screwed up as well. We in our own company in the last 6 months, because we've got CI/CD, we found something fell over. We spent 2 weeks trying to fix what was wrong with our own code to find out it was something that we had imported. So you have issues like that. We've had the problem, people have lost a little bit of trust in CentOS, okay, because the trouble with Red Hat and the change in licensing there. So can I ask the panel, and you've only got 1 minute each or 1.5 minutes each to do this, what's wrong with open source? What are the things to worry about? And we'll do the good bit as well. We'll do that last. So Karen, can I ask you to do it again? What are the red flags? What do people need to worry about?
So I think for me, we've probably covered some of these already, like what's come up top of mind for everybody around the licensing, the complexity there, making sure you get it right. So I don't think it's bad. It's a question of how you structure and make sure you have the capability, tooling, and you understand how you're going to use it. As you just touched on there, Jerry, I think everybody has the fear, these developers are not in my organization. Do I trust these developers, right? Is somebody going to go rogue and cause major implications for the software I'm running? Look, and security, I think security has been a big myth, like, is the software secure? There's actually tools out there as well, and there's the OpenSSF that actually VMware contributes to, which is a standards body. So standards on open source where you can look at tooling for how secure is the open source libraries that you're running. But what I would say to counteract those arguments and those risks, that's what I normally hear from customers and from companies when they're looking at open source. Those three areas, right, are the areas most concerned. I would say that there is, from the bug fixing, the bug issues kind of, yeah, you do have to be careful, run it through your security vulnerability scans, all of that kind of stuff, but things will happen. In the open source community, if you've got a thriving open source community supporting you, you're not as, I think it was Joe mentioned, at the or Stephen, at the hands of that commercial vendor. Things will be fixed and it will move faster. So I think that's the flip side of that for me. So those three areas, I would say, is what I always hear about as the risks around open source.
Stephen, yeah.
Your example about Red Hat, Jerry, forced me to look into my crystal ball and say there's a potential paradox coming down the road with open source that could be risky. And we talked about the commercial models of open source and the commercialization of open source in recent years. Microsoft is, VMware, Dell, any number of companies has really kind of pushed this down the road, in terms of being able to contribute and get the agility and scale you need with open source, right? But also the over commercialization. I'm gonna use a touch of hyperbole and say the over commercialization of it. So we can go from a subscription model, which is kind of difficult for people to buy into, to the cloud model, which is just, well, put your credit card in the slot and you've got this product, right, which is underpinned by open source. Now, what happens next? Do companies get to, and I think the Red Hat example is an example of this, do companies get too invested in the commercialization of these products and projects to the point that they start changing the goalposts? So in the Red Hat example, where they changed the licensing model for CentOS, something I built or config on, and now that's directly impacted my next decision with what's the underlying OS that depended. So when a network engineer comes and says, oh, what can I install or config? And I say it's CentOS 6, 7, 8, right? Knock yourself out. And then in the last 2 months, they're coming along saying, when you change into Ubuntu or when you change into SUSE, because we're changing now, because we don't want to be caught in this trap. We like CentOS, we like what it does for us, and we like that it's free. We like that it's maintained by Red Hat. They consume that project a number of years back. So I'm fearing, and all you need is the wrong type of direction in a company like Microsoft for the open source to be projects and efforts there to become too commercialized. I hope that makes sense. So I hope I didn't scare everyone. Joe.
Yeah, I actually, just even touching on that point, I think that's a really valid point to make, especially at the moment. And I think we are seeing activity around around open source that is making decisions based on commercial activity. So I mean, even I think in the last couple of days, Amazon announced they've forked Elasticsearch into OpenSearch because Elastic, the company, had made some changes to try and make it harder for Amazon to use Elasticsearch for AWS because it was competing with the Elastic cloud product. So there's all of these things are kind of happening around the commercial entities that power a lot of open source today. So I think it's a hugely valid point and something we're definitely going to see more and more of, and it's definitely a cause for concern and something we need to keep an eye out for. But like one of the things probably closer to home in terms of like potential negatives and things like that are, you know, oftentimes I think we think of open source and we think of like the big projects and the big tools and platforms, you know, the Linux, the Git, the MySQL of the world, you know, where it's like it's a battle tested, tried and tested, proven, you know, like completely scalable solution. But a lot of open source is actually, you know, about small and tiny libraries and packages that in many cases are actually maintained by one person who's likely working on it in their spare time. And one of the things that, like, you know, I think we haven't talked about it is where a situation where you're relying on a package like this or a library, and the person who's maintaining it no longer wants or can maintain it, and you know, where they essentially abandon the project. And I think, you know, I think all companies who are using open source technology have like a responsibility to, you know, if they want to use and leverage and get the benefit of open source, they need to be prepared for that event to happen, and they need to be prepared to make sure that continuity continues into the future for the packages that they're relying on. So I do think the sustainability question is one that I think it's getting a little bit better, but I think it's getting a little bit better too slowly. I think we do need to figure out a better model of supporting open source, and particularly the smaller open source contributors and maintainers who are not seeing the kind of financial assistance and support from large enterprises that you'll see with some of the larger projects. So yeah, that's probably my my negative point, Jerry.
Oh, okay, so look, we're on the home stretch. I want to finish on the positives. Okay, so let me frame this by saying I think a lot of people look at open source, and if they're outside the community, the first thing they say, well, the benefit must be it's free. I don't share that view at all. Can I ask you for your positives? And even though I'm an MC, I want to throw in one. I want to ask your opinion on this. Is it easier to hire people if you have an open source policy within your company? I certainly feel that that's the case. So can I ask you for your positives and specifically comment on the employee, on you as an employer? Do you become more attractive if you have an active open source situation?
Yeah, I'll start off there. Look, first of all, even looking at VMware, it absolutely is more attractive. The best developers want to work on the most innovative things, right? And a lot of that happens in the open source community. So if you are using open source and contributing to open source, they're going to be attracted to come and work. They're going to want to stay. Because they're getting that exposure, and absolutely, I believe that you will attract and retain the best talent if you have these policies, and we have seen it at VMware. So I totally agree with you, Jerry, on that front. With regard to the benefits, look, the biggest benefit I see is innovation. Technology is moving so fast. Everybody is just driving at such a pace. That community, that amount of talent. So going back to the talent question and the developers working on this and having so many people contributing, the innovation is so fast, and that's why people love it, right? You can actually develop and deliver for your business much faster. So for me, and that's why companies like Joe's company that are born in the cloud just absolutely rely on open source, right? You have to, for that innovation and that growth, and that is the biggest benefit I see from open source today.
60 seconds, Stephen.
Yeah, I guess two quick things. Thinking your question, Jerry, and actually thinking about it from a personal perspective, open source has made me more employable. I think it's made me more attractive. And just taking your question in a personal light, you know, just in a kind of different way. I would definitely be attracted to companies who see open source as a business imperative, and that to me says a lot about the culture of a company in respect of community, in respect to giving back, in respect to sustainability, in respect of not everything is about the commercialization, right? Now that's important, right? Creating value is important, but not every, so career growth for me, and definitely it tells me a lot about the culture of a company where I might want to work. One other quick thing, and I'm looking at a question here, you know, about financial institutions saying absolutely no way to open source. And I would say in that regard, to put a positive spin on it, and tongue in cheek, if they're using Android phones, they're using open source, right? It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. We don't get to say no to open source. We get to learn how to embrace it. So it's an education thing, it's a learning thing, it's an adoption journey, if that makes sense. But it's ubiquitous, you know. So, Joe.
Yeah, and I'll be super quick. I think open source is great because it's more fun, it's more enjoyable, and yeah, I definitely, like, as somebody who's used both enterprise proprietary tools in the past and has used open source, like I've definitely had a much more enjoyable experience working with open source technology. On the employer question, Jerry, like 100% yes. I mean, you know, back in the core HR days, we were trying to hire Oracle and PL SQL developers and, you know, people for this EXTJS framework, which, you know, went commercial and proprietary, and it was a nightmare. And today we're looking for React developers, you know, people with Nginx and MySQL and PHP and all of these open source technologies, and it's a million times easier on both sides of the fence, I think, because there's more people with these skills, and there's more people and people are looking for companies that embrace these technologies as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Joe, Stephen and Karen. I'm looking at the comments and questions coming in, and we actually haven't touched on many of them. I did promise to finish at 9, so we're going to finish up here. But I would even go so far as to say that I sit on the committee at IT at Cork for events. I'm going to ask the committee, okay, to do another open source event, maybe in 6 months' time or 8 months' time again. So I think it's a topic we'll come back to. I personally enjoy this immensely. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Karen. Thanks to IT at Cork for organising it, Juliet for introducing it. In the background, Vivian has been organising it. So I don't think there's any further ado. Vivian, if you can wind us up and walk us out, thank you very much. So we'll let the music play. Have a nice rest of your day. And thank you so much for a really enjoyable event from my perspective. All the best, everybody.